Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are systematically unpacking a truly landmark Supreme Court ruling on human trafficking. We're going to examine the absolutely fascinating and meticulous way our judicial system dissects a crime, evaluates the evidence, and ultimately delivers justice. We'll be looking specifically at Supreme Court decision GR No. 23457, which affirmed the conviction of John Paul Lopez. Now, it's a sobering case for sure, but it provides an incredibly clear step-by-step lens into how the law actually operates to protect the most vulnerable people in society. All right, let's jump right in by looking at the sheer scale of the penalties handed down here. We're talking about life imprisonment plus a staggering 2 million peso fine. And you have to keep in mind, this penalty was applied per count, and there were 2 distinct counts in this case. Highlighting this right off the bat really shows us the absolute high stakes we're dealing with. The Supreme Court doesn't just hand down these kinds of sentences lightly, right? It requires ironclad proof. And today we're going to look exactly at how the prosecution built that undeniable case from the ground up. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the crime and the law. Second, the facts of the case. Third, the 3 elements proven. Fourth, the weakness of bare denial. And finally, the final verdict. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the crime and the law, demystifying RAA No. 9208. So the specific statute the accused violated is Republic Act 9208. That's the law against trafficking in persons. But the charge here was elevated to qualified trafficking. You might be wondering, why qualified? Well, under Section 6 of the law, the crime automatically gets bumped up to qualified status, which carries far, far heavier penalties whenever the trafficked person is a child under the age of 18. In this specific case, the victim, who is referred to in the court records simply as BBB to protect her identity, was only a 13-year-old minor who had run away from home. Moving right along to Section 2, the facts of the case. Let's look at the timeline of exploitation. The chronological narrative of this case unfolds incredibly fast over just a few intense weeks in late 2011. On August 30th, the first incident took place. The accused brought the 13-year-old to a McDonald's near the Marikina Sports Center, negotiated with a man, and then actually put her in a taxi directed to the Grand Polo Motel in Antipolo City. Just over a week later, on September 9th, a nearly identical second incident happens. But then, the timeline accelerates drastically on September 12th. The victim was finally found by her mother, who immediately reported the whole situation to the barangay. And law enforcement, they moved with incredible speed. By 3 a.m. that very same day, police conducted a sting operation at the accused's residence in Marikina City, where he was positively identified and arrested. Next up is Section 3, the 3 elements proven. This is really the anatomy of the crime. To actually secure a conviction in court, the prosecution has to hit 3 distinct legal targets conclusively. First, they need the act, like recruitment or transportation. Second, they need the means, such as taking advantage of vulnerability or using payments. And third, the purpose, which in this context means sexual exploitation or prostitution. It's a package deal. It's not enough to prove just 1 or 2 of these. The state must prove all 3 beyond a reasonable doubt. So, bringing you right inside the courtroom, the prosecution proved that very first element, the act, through the young victim's own words. She testified that Lopez, the accused, instructed her to board a taxi with a male client, directly facilitating her transport to the Grand Polo Motel. By organizing this meeting and physically directing her transportation, that rigid legal definition for the act of trafficking, it was firmly and undeniably met. Then we get to the second element, the means. And the transaction that followed really tells the whole story here. The victim testified that after she returned from the motel, Lopez handed her 1,000 pesos. The Supreme Court noted that Lopez intentionally took advantage of BB's highly vulnerable state. She was a runaway minor, completely separated from her family, and he enticed her with this payment. This fulfilled the legal requirement for the means used to traffic a person. Now, hold on, because there's a really crucial legal nuance here. The Supreme Court cited this powerful doctrine from a case called People v. Villanueva. Basically, when the trafficked person is a child, the prosecution doesn't even necessarily have to prove coercive or deceptive means. Under Philippine law, a minor's consent to prostitution is fundamentally invalid. It's never considered to be given out of free will, because of their inherent vulnerability. The law offers an absolute shield here, essentially recognizing that a 13-year-old simply cannot legally or morally consent to their own exploitation. And that brings us to the third and final element, the purpose. This transcript excerpt is just heartbreaking, but it's vital.
The victim straightforwardly recounts being told to have sex with the man in exchange for payment. This unequivocally establishes the ultimate intent. The entire operation orchestrated by Lopez was explicitly, undeniably for prostitution and sexual exploitation. So all three legal elements, totally locked in.
Okay, Section 4, the weakness of bare denial, where we evaluate the clashing defenses. So, in criminal law, when you have two completely different stories, how does a judge actually decide? Well, courts rely on highly established guidelines to weigh the truth. On one side of the aisle, the prosecution presented the affirmative, credible, and remarkably consistent testimony of the young victim. In stark contrast, on the other side, Lopez offered nothing but an unsubstantiated alibi and a bare denial. The Supreme Court firmly emphasizes a major legal doctrine here. An affirmative testimony, someone clearly stating a fact happened, will always carry far more weight than an uncorroborated, empty denial that simply claims it didn't. To break this down a bit more, the defense basically tried to establish an ill motive. Lopez claimed he didn't do it, and that BBB was just lying out of spite because she was the ex-girlfriend of Lopez's current boyfriend. But when the trial court and the Supreme Court evaluated this, they found it to be a completely unproven, empty claim. There wasn't a single piece of evidence to back it up. Furthermore, while Lopez had zero corroboration for his alibi, the victim's harrowing testimony was actually backed up by hard science. A medical legal report prepared by a crime lab officer showed physical trauma that was entirely consistent with her story. So confronted with a completely unverified alibi up against a medically corroborated testimony, the court obviously placed its full faith in the victim's story. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the final verdict in a Supreme Court's affirmation. Finding absolutely no reason whatsoever to overturn the lower courts, the Supreme Court completely affirmed the conviction. Lopez was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of 2 counts of qualified trafficking in persons. And the judicial hammer came down with absolute certainty. Let's look at this. For each count, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was ordered to pay a fine of 2 million pesos per count. And on top of all that, he was ordered to pay 500,000 pesos in moral damages, plus 100,000 pesos in exemplary damages per count to the victim, gathering a 6% annual interest rate until it's fully paid off. Now, you might be wondering, why did the Supreme Court side so firmly with the trial court's assessment? Well, it all comes down to a core philosophy in Philippine law. Appellate courts, like the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, they're essentially just reading written transcripts. Because of this, they fundamentally trust the trial judges. It's the trial judge who actually sits in the room, looks the witness in the eye, and observes their demeanor, their conduct, and their attitude while they're testifying. The trial judge is in the absolute best position to spot the truth from a lie. Because the trial judge found this 13-year-old victim credible, unwavering, and completely unbiased, the Supreme Court gave her testimony full faith and credit. At the end of the day, the entire architecture of a conviction is built on brave voices stepping forward and a legal system meticulously structured to actually hear them. So I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. If the ultimate strength of our justice system relies on credible voices taking the stand, how can we continue to protect, encourage, and empower those who are entirely unable to protect themselves so they feel safe speaking their truth? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of how the law actively works to protect the most vulnerable among us.